A Pokeball? Oh no!
It's actually kind of nice in here.
Hi, welcome to Player 2 Props. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I made this super shiny Pokeball. Oh, it's so shiny. The whole point of this build, for me at least, was to test my finishing abilities because, believe it or not, this Pokeball was 3D printed. I wanted to see if I could take a rough 3D print and turn it into something super smooth and shiny that you would never even know was 3D printed. The secret is a whole lot of sanding. Anyway, let's just jump right into the build. So the first step was to 3D print everything. The file will be linked in the description. This was modeled with a flimsy 3D printed latch. It broke on me right away, but thankfully there were these holes already modeled in it. They were just about the right size for some magnets I already had, so I took my Dremel and a drill bit to widen the holes. I slapped some safety glasses on my face and got to it. I have my Dremel here on a flex shaft. It makes it a lot easier to do work like this. Now that the magnets fit in the holes, I just have to secure them in place. So I decided to mix up some 5-minute epoxy. I make sure to wear gloves and even a respirator while working with this stuff. It's pretty nasty. First epoxy goes in, then the magnet, and wipe away the excess. Now for the other magnet, just make sure you line them up properly. You don't want to get the polarities wrong. I personally check like 6 or 7 times. While the epoxy was curing, I cleaned up my 3D print. I had a nasty seam that I didn't want to have to sand by hand, so I dremeled it down with a grinding bit. I also ground away the inner seam and any area that was less than perfect. You don't want to stay in one spot too long or you'll melt through the plastic. Once the seams were flush, I had to tackle the rest of the part. So in comes my big box of sandpaper. I grabbed some 120 grit to start off. And then I just went to town. The goal here is to knock down the high points of the layer lines as much as possible. The more elbow grease you put in here, the less work you have to do later. Next I grabbed some flexible sandpaper so I could get the curve on the inside. Then I did the same thing to the other shell. And the exact same process for the inner cage piece. So at this point the pieces are a lot smoother than they were before, but not nearly smooth enough. To fix that, we're going to use a special paste, Bondo Glazing and Spot Putty. It's used on cars to fill in minor scratches and dents, but it works perfectly here to fill in the low points on these parts. I made sure to put on a good amount and work it into all the small cracks and crevices. This is actually my first time using Bondo. I usually use wood filler for this process, but I've seen other people use it and I figured I'd give it a try. It's smellier than wood filler, but it dries a lot faster, which is really convenient. I made it dry even faster with a hairdryer because I'm impatient. I then sanded down the Bondo. I used 150 grit sandpaper. The whole point of this process is to bring the high points and the low points together. You bring the high points down with sanding and the low points up with filling. Then you have one uniform, smooth surface. Bondo sands really well, but it creates a ton of dust, and you don't want to breathe any of this in, so wear a mask or respirator. Once the Bondo's been sanded, the piece is pretty smooth, but there's still crevices that are too small for the Bondo to get into. That's where filler primer comes in. This stuff is a primer that goes on thick, and it helps to even everything out. It's also a good base for the paint to stick to. Another benefit of primer is it really showcases all your crimes. It's easier to see all kinds of inconsistencies in the surface, especially layer lines. The next step for me was to wet sand the primer. My plan was to go from 400 to 1000 grit. So with the 400 grit sandpaper and a little bit of soapy water, I got to it. Wet sanding is great because it doesn't generate a bunch of dust. So on this first pass, I knocked the primer all the way down back to the plastic. This guaranteed that the only primer left would be filling in the low spots. The other pieces got wet sanded as well. I then applied another coat of filler primer. This one would get wet sanded with 600 grit, and all the way up to 1000 grit. I didn't want to go all the way through the primer on this pass. 600 grit might have been smooth enough, but I wanted to go up to 1000 grit just to be safe. Here you can see the difference a sanding makes. On the left is the freshly painted shell, on the right is the one that's been sanded up to 1000 grit. Once everything was wet sanded, it was time to give everything some color. I used these Rust-Oleum spray paints. I've used them before and they give good coverage, but I did have a few problems with them. See, I don't have a paint booth. You might think I'm crazy for attempting this without a paint booth. And you might be right, but the paints didn't help. They take a while to dry, and the whole time they can be collecting dust. And for me, they definitely were. I didn't want to have to wet sand the color coat, but I did, because of the dust. I felt like I was on a time crunch. I had to get the dust out of the paint and recoat it within an hour, or I would have to wait 2 days. I later found out that just because the can says that you can recoat after 2 days doesn't mean you should. When I tried, the new coat of paint got a weird texture, but eventually I had everything color coded and clear coated. But I did get some orange peel in my clear coat, which is a weird texture you can get in spray paint. To fix it, I had some Zona polishing papers. This stuff is like super fine sandpaper. They go up to much higher grits than regular sandpaper. With these I could knock down the texture and get the shine I was after. I only polished one half of the shell so I could show you the difference it makes over time. So enjoy this polishing montage. This is the final grit of Zona paper. As you can see, it's pretty shiny, but it's not quite shiny enough. For that, I'm going to pull out some automotive compound and polish. I figured if this stuff is good enough to make cars shine, it's good enough for my Pokeball. I applied it with a microfiber applicator pad, the compound first. I just followed the directions on the bottle. You rub it in and then just wipe it off. And just look how shiny that already is. Here you can really see how much smoother the polished side is compared to the orange peel on the other side. But I wasn't finished yet. I still wanted to add the automotive polish. It goes on much like the compound. You just rub it in, and then you buff it off. And now that is what I'm talking about. Just look how smooth that's gotten. Especially compared to this side. I then did the same round of polishing on the white side. Now to protect the polished surface, I used some automotive wax. I've already applied it here, but it's as simple as wax on, wax off. Now they're both super shiny and protected. The button was painted white with spray paint, and I added the black trim with enamel model paint and a brush. Now I had to work on the inside of the ball. I took some green acrylic paint and some foil tape to make the inside a little more accurate to the show. The foil tape got cut into pieces and pressed into the ball. It wasn't completely smooth, but I was less concerned because the inside wasn't the focus of this project. It's still nice and shiny though. With one side done, for some reason I didn't move on to the next side. I decided instead to paint on the green. It's not shown here, but I decided to dilute the paint so it would go in smoother and spread itself out. That way I wouldn't risk painting any part that I didn't want to. The green looks good. Now I decided to put the foil into the red shell. Any excess got trimmed with a knife. It's easy to cut, and also easy to peel off. I sure love foil tape, such an easy way to get a metallic finish. Finally, it was time to put everything together, and for that I turned to my favorite super glue. The parts that make contact are the bottom and the upper ring, so that's where the glue would go. But not so fast. I still had to score everything. Doing this gives the glue something to bite into. It really helps to ensure a good bond. Now it's time for the scary part, the glue. There's no going back after this. I repeat the process for the other shell. And the button gets glued into the top shell. And oh boy, there's only one step left. We just gotta bring those halves together. I clipped off a piece of wire coat hanger to use as a hinge pin. The pin just gets pressed into place. It's cut so that it doesn't peek out too far. Now we can close this baby up. And it's done! I mean, you saw it at the beginning, but this took a lot of work. If there's anything I learned, it's that spray paint kind of sucks. I would have had a lot less trouble with this build if I just airbrushed the colors on and maybe put like a rattle can clear coat over afterwards, because there was a lot of time spent just waiting for paint to dry and cure and putting another layer over an old layer. That created a a weird reaction, strange texture. I also learned that you really don't want to try to get a finish this smooth without a paint booth. That was a lot of struggle, but all in all, I'm happy with the result. It's a beautiful little Pokeball, and it will look great on my shelf. Thank you for watching this video. I'm new to YouTube, so if you liked it, please leave a like. It helps me out a lot. And if you didn't like it, leave me a comment. I'd love to know how I can improve. I've got more builds planned, so if you want to see any of those, consider subscribing. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going home.